She said you would try to burn it all down, the small voice whispered from the darkness beneath the loose floorboards. Sarah froze, her cheap suitcase clattering against the rough timber floor. She had driven 800 miles to this derelict mountain cabin, her supposed inheritance from a grandmother she'd never met. And now she was not alone. The cabin, listed as abandoned for 3 decades, smelled heavily of pine and something else, stale bread and old sweat. Sarah gripped the heavy iron poker near the hearth. "Who is there?" she demanded, her voice catching. The floor creaked again. The impossible sound came not from a ghost, but from something undeniably alive. The silence that followed was thick, confirming that the secret wasn't money or jewelry, but something much more immediate and dangerous. Sarah stood rigid in the center of the dust-choked living room. The air was thin, cold even though the sun had long set outside. A single bare light bulb strung from a frayed wire cast weak yellow light over the chaos. The cabin was larger than the real estate pictures suggested and vastly more neglected. Dust motes danced in the pathetic illumination, thick as fog. Sarah lowered the poker, the metal heavy and cold in her hand, but her gaze remained fixed on the warped section of the floor near the stone fireplace. For a moment, she was not Sarah, the struggling single mother from the city. She was just a tired woman whose nerves had been stretched too thin by too many years of fighting for every small kindness. She had come here hoping for silence, hoping the sale of this place would afford her daughter Lily a real bed, and maybe 1 year without the crushing anxiety of eviction notices. The silence she found was contaminated. She moved to the kitchen, a space dominated by a rusted wood-burning stove and a sink stained brown with mineral deposits. She opened the refrigerator. It was dead, silent, and smelled faintly of rot. She carried her meager bag of groceries, a loaf of white bread, a jar of peanut butter, to the only clean surface she could find, a small, splintered table covered with a faded oilcloth. Sarah avoided looking directly at her reflection in the dirty window glass. The reflection was of a woman who looked older than her 32 years, marked by a perpetual tightness around the jaw. She had learned early to rely only on the weight of her own actions. Trust was a foreign currency she could not afford. Her mother, who had abandoned her on a church steps at 6, had taught her that lesson definitively. People always leave. She spread a blanket on the floor, ignoring the ancient, lumpy mattress in the corner. Sleeping low to the ground felt safer, less exposed. The voice from the floorboards had receded, but the tension had not. Every structural groan of the old wood was now amplified, sounding less like settling and more like surveillance. She ate her cold, dry sandwich, the sound of her chewing loud in the overwhelming quiet of the mountain. She did not dare light a fire in the hearth. Not yet. She needed to understand who or what else inhabited this inheritance. The poker lay within arm's reach. The next morning, the voice was silent, replaced by the insistent, demanding call of the mountain air, crisp, clean, and carrying the distant sound of an engine. Sarah rose stiffly. Her sleep had been fractured, punctuated by the smallest of creaks. She was dragging the heaviest trunk out of the cramped storage closet, determined to clear the space for a quick sale, when the sound of a truck pulling up on the gravel driveway made her stop. A moment later, a knock echoed, formal and brief. Sarah hesitated, gripping the trunk handle. She had told no one she was here. She opened the door to find a woman standing on the porch. The woman looked to be in her late 40s, sturdy and deeply tanned, wearing sensible work boots and a faded flannel jacket. Her face was etched with the kind of tired patience only found in people who do hard, consistent work. Beside her stood a small boy, perhaps 7 years old, holding a half-eaten apple and staring up at Sarah with immense, serious brown eyes. "Sarah? Sarah Miller?" the woman asked, her voice low and steady. "I'm Amelia Jones. I manage the property lines for the Mountain Trust. Saw your car earlier. Your grandmother, old Mrs. Peterson, she asked me to look out for things." Sarah's guard remained up. Look out for what? Amelia didn't flinch at the sharpness of the tone. She simply shifted the heavy cooler she was carrying. "For you, mostly. I brought some fresh water, real coffee, and a generator. The power in this place hasn't worked right since '98. This is Ethan." She motioned briefly to the boy. Ethan gave a short, solemn nod, inspecting the dirt on Sarah's jeans. Amelia's presence was reassuringly solid, devoid of the overly bright enthusiasm Sarah distrusted. She didn't press for conversation, just walked past Sarah and set the generator down efficiently near the porch. She moved with the quiet competence of someone who knew exactly where everything should go. "Ethan, can you take that bag of kindling to the hearth? Be careful with the door," Amelia instructed. Ethan, without complaint, wrestled the bag inside. His movements were slow, careful, and strangely accustomed to the dark interior. Amelia glanced at the trunk Sarah was moving. "Too heavy for one person. Let me grab that side." She didn't ask if Sarah wanted help. She simply offered the labor. It was a kindness offered not as charity, but as shared effort. Sarah hesitated, then conceded, feeling the first, small release of tension in days. "Enquanto você assiste essa história se desenrolar, me diga nos comentários de onde você está assistindo." Together, the two women wrestled the heavy, moth-eaten trunk out onto the porch. Amelia didn't comment on the layers of dust or the faint, musty smell clinging to everything Sarah owned. Her focus was purely practical. Within an hour, the generator was purring softly, bringing a hesitant, buzzing life back to the cabin's electrical system. The light bulb in the living room now burned with a steadier glow. Ethan settled himself quietly on the porch steps, meticulously whittling a stick with a small, dull knife. He was silent, observing Sarah's movements with an intense curiosity that wasn't invasive, just utterly honest. Amelia was inspecting the fireplace chimney. The flue's mostly clear, but the inside brickwork needs monitoring. "Cold night ahead. You'll need a fire." "I don't usually," Sarah mumbled. Fire always felt like an uncontrollable risk, a danger too close to the essentials. Amelia paused, turning to Sarah. "Up here, fire is survival. It's not comfort. It's necessity." She pointed towards the woodpile, neatly stacked and covered near the shed. "I restocked it 2 weeks ago, just in case. Your grandmother was meticulous about winterizing, even when she wasn't here." Sarah felt a strange tightening in her chest at the mention of the meticulous grandmother who had still managed to leave the property to a total stranger. Amelia set about building a fire herself. She worked methodically, the kindling catching instantly under her practiced hands. Soon, the hearth was radiating a deep, orange heat that pushed the damp chill out of the room. The scent of pine smoke filled the air, thick and earthy, a smell that anchored the space. "Stay for coffee," Sarah found herself saying, surprised by the invitation. It felt like an extension of the shared effort, not a social grace. Amelia looked up, wiping soot from her glove. "I'd like that. Haven't had a cup that wasn't lukewarm since sunrise." They sat at the small, wobbly table. Sarah poured the strong, hot coffee Amelia had brought and offered her half of her dwindling peanut butter supply on the white bread. They ate in companionable silence. Amelia didn't ask about Sarah's life, her journey, or why she looked so exhausted. She spoke only of the land, the coming frost, the deer tracks near the spring, and the strange, quiet way the mountain kept its secrets. It was an environment without judgment, where the necessities were too urgent to allow for small talk. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the sharp edges of her own solitude begin to dull slightly, surrounded by the warm, simple routine of someone else's functional world. As Amelia finished her coffee and stepped outside to pack up the generator, Sarah started sweeping the hearth. The fire had left a fine, silver-grey ash, and she used an antique metal dustpan she had unearthed from beneath a pile of old blankets. The dustpan was heavy and strangely ornate, unlike the utilitarian items everywhere else in the cabin. Embedded in the handle was a small, smooth, oval stone, a river rock, polished dark by time or handling. As Sarah gripped it, the texture was immediately familiar, pulling her back with a sudden, painful clarity. She was 6 again, cold, sitting on the bottom step of a church portico in a city she didn't know. Her mother had said she was going inside for 5 minutes to pray and had given Sarah a stone, telling her, "Hold this tight. It keeps the waiting from hurting." Sarah had held it until her knuckles were white. Hours later, a kind police officer had pried the cold stone from her small hand. The waiting had not stopped hurting. It had just become permanent. Sarah had kept that original stone for years, a pointless, heavy talisman of rejection, until a particularly hard winter when she'd thrown it into a river, trying to jettison the memory with it. Now, holding the dustpan, the weight of the stone in the handle felt identical. This wasn't her stone, but the connection was immediate and suffocating. Her grandmother, the woman who had only existed as a name on a legal document, had known this feeling. She must have. Amelia re-entered the cabin, sensing the sudden shift in the air. She found Sarah motionless, staring at the dustpan. "That old thing," Amelia commented lightly. "Mrs. Peterson cherished that. Said she found the stone when she was very small and had it set in the handle, kept it right here." She tapped the edge of the hearth, always ready. Sarah felt the sting of unspoken history. The grandmother had never claimed her, never contacted her, yet here was evidence of a shared language of abandonment, expressed through a small, worthless object meant to ground a person during times of terrible, solitary waiting. She placed the dustpan carefully back on the stone ledge. The memory, short and sharp, had done its work. The quiet, solitary existence she had built was a direct consequence of that cold church step. And she realized that, just like that child, she was still holding her breath, waiting for the next person to walk away. The secret under the floorboards felt less important than the history on the hearth. Amelia returned every evening for the next week, not to impose, but under the guise of necessity. She needed to check the generator fuel. She had leftover stew. She needed to inspect a boundary marker near the spring. Sarah watched her, recognizing the deliberate, non-invasive proximity. It wasn't friendship. It was the establishment of a network of safety. Ethan, the silent observer, became the anchor of these evenings. He didn't play or demand attention. He simply occupied space, a quiet, solid presence. He learned Sarah's routine quickly, bringing her specific tools when he saw her struggling with a jammed window or handing her a clean rag without being asked. One afternoon, Sarah was trying to scrub the old kitchen floor, a futile effort, when Ethan walked in, carrying a small, heavy leather book. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it silently on the clean portion of the table. "Grandma Peterson kept this," he said, his first real conversation piece. "It's for the mountain." The book was a simple ledger, filled with neat, looping handwriting. It wasn't a diary or a record of finances, but a log of favors. When Mrs. Peterson had mended a fence for the neighboring rancher, when she had left a package of frozen venison for Amelia, when she had repaired a trail marker for the Forest Service. It was a silent accounting of community. Sarah read the entries, realizing her grandmother hadn't been defined by what she kept, but by what she silently gave. The fire was now a constant, comforting roar in the hearth. Sarah found herself looking forward to the smell of pine smoke that accompanied Amelia's arrival. They rarely spoke of anything personal. Their conversations centered on the mundane, the quickest way to seal a drafty window, the correct setting for the water pump, the location of the best foraging spots. Sarah started leaving the door to the cabin unlocked. She began saving a portion of her coffee for Amelia. She found herself moving, with less guardedness in the house, the physical tension in her shoulders easing. She wasn't fighting the world here. She was merely maintaining a space, and she wasn't maintaining it alone. Ethan, meanwhile, started leaving small, perfect gifts: a single, smooth feather found in the woods, a piece of crystal quartz, a carefully folded napkin with a drawing of a lopsided house. He gave them without ceremony, and Sarah accepted them with the same solemnity. They were building a tenuous, unacknowledged structure of belonging. The deep-seated fear of being alone still resided in her, but now it was buffered by the expectation of a truck engine and the sound of heavy boots on the porch. She was included, not by request, but by persistence. The fragile routine shattered on a Tuesday. Sarah was finally gaining momentum in cleaning the last of the cabin's derelict corners, the narrow, dusty space beneath the main floorboards. She had bought a cheap crowbar and, remembering the whispered voice from the first night, was working carefully around the area near the hearth. Amelia arrived earlier than usual, her face tight with worry. Ethan trailed behind her, his small body vibrating with unspoken distress. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about the spring," Amelia began, her voice strained. "The one that feeds your well. Someone moved the stones for the diversion channel, and the flow is being cut off for the lower properties." Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans, feeling the familiar prickle of defensiveness. "I haven't touched anything outside of this house. I barely know which way the water runs." "I know, but there's only a few people up here," Amelia insisted, though her gaze kept flicking toward the crowbar and the section of floor Sarah was inspecting. "I found this, near the stream." She held up a discarded plastic wrapper, brightly colored, store-bought candy. Sarah felt a cold wave wash over her. She did not allow Lily, her real daughter still miles away waiting, to eat that kind of sugar, and she certainly hadn't bought it for herself. But Ethan, who was standing frozen by the door, often carried small treats. Before Sarah could ask, Amelia looked directly at the loose floorboards. "Sarah, you're looking for something. What is it?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it felt like an invasion. Sarah was still fiercely protecting the secret of the voice, the strange, impossible presence she knew lived beneath her floor. If she revealed the truth, Amelia might involve authorities, destroying the fragile sense of belonging she had found. "It's just repairs," Sarah said flatly, her tone shutting down the conversation. "I need to fix the structure before the sale. What are you implying, Amelia?" Amelia took a deep breath, her own exhaustion evident. "I'm implying that there are things about this property and about Mrs. Peterson that you don't know, things that rely on discretion. I'm asking if you know who moved the spring stones, because if the water runs dry for the valley, this cabin will be deemed a hazard, and that'll ruin your chance to sell." Sarah saw the genuine fear in Amelia's eyes, but her own fear, the fear of exposure and of having her chance at financial security stolen, was stronger. She picked up the crowbar. "I said I didn't touch it, and I am inspecting my own property, Amelia. I appreciate the help, but I need some space now." The silence that followed was immense, crushing the warmth of the fire. Ethan flinched, interpreting the dismissal immediately. Amelia nodded, a slow, heavy movement of resignation. "Understood, Sarah. Call me if you change your mind about that water. Otherwise, I'll take Ethan and we'll check the valley." She didn't say goodbye, just turned and walked away. The sound of her truck engine fading into the distance. The routine was violently gone, replaced by the acute, searing pain of rejection. Sarah was alone again, the crowbar still heavy in her hand. Sarah worked through the night, but not on the repairs. She couldn't shake the image of Amelia's defeated posture and Ethan's quiet distress. The sting of being alone was less painful than the knowledge that she had dismissed genuine concern. She realized with a profound clarity that the water problem wasn't a property dispute. It was a crisis for the community that Amelia was trying to hold together. She found the loose section of the floorboards and pried them open carefully, revealing a cramped, dirt-floored crawl space. The smell of stale air and pine needles rushed up, but also the metallic scent of sweat. And then she saw him. Not a ghost, not a dangerous intruder, but a boy, older than Ethan, maybe 12 or 13, huddled against the cold stone of the foundation. He was thin, pale, and clutching a tattered blanket. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes wide with raw animal fear. "Don't yell," he whispered, his voice the same one she'd heard days ago. "She said you'd call the police." "Who said?" Sarah asked, her voice low. She didn't move the crowbar. "Grandma Peterson. She told me to stay here if anyone came. She hid me here for months. Said no one could know." Sarah felt the entire history of her grandmother shift beneath her feet. The boy explained his name was David, that he had no parents, and that Mrs. Peterson had been his secret guardian, keeping him off the grid, hidden from a system that she feared would swallow him whole. "I needed water," David admitted, trembling. "I snuck out yesterday morning. I was desperate, and I saw the candy wrapper on the ground, so I used the stones near the spring to make a small pool to drink from. I put them back, I swear. I just didn't know how to make the stream flow the right way." The shame was instantaneous and sharp. Sarah hadn't been protecting a secret. She had protected her own isolated self, cutting off the only link she had found. She looked at the boy, frightened, hungry, and impossibly vulnerable. This was the true inheritance, the secret task Mrs. Peterson had left. Sarah silently pulled a fresh blanket from her bag and handed it down. "David, you're coming up. I'm not calling anyone. But we have to fix the water before sunrise. Amelia and Ethan are going to suffer for my mistake." She took 2 large plastic buckets and her heavy work lamp. Without a word, she left the cabin and hiked down the steep, moonlit path to the spring. She found the haphazardly piled stones. Using the memory of the land Amelia had described, Sarah worked methodically, channeling the cold water back into the proper diversion course. Her hands were raw, her back screaming, but she kept working, not for the sale of the cabin, but to erase the damage caused by her immediate suspicion. She was choosing to protect the integrity of the fragile community she had just scorned. It was almost noon when Sarah returned to the cabin, exhausted and caked in mud. David, still wary, was sitting inside, curled up near the fire, chewing slowly on a piece of bread Sarah had left him. Moments later, the sound of the truck on the gravel driveway announced the inevitable return. Sarah stood by the door, bracing herself for the confrontation, the apologies, and the necessary explanation. Amelia stepped onto the porch. She looked directly at Sarah's muddied boots and the deep circles under her eyes. She carried no generator, no tools, and no cooler. She simply held a thermos. "The stream is running full again," Amelia stated, her voice neutral. "Someone worked on the channel all night." Sarah didn't deny it or seek credit. It was fixed. Amelia didn't press. Instead, her gaze drifted past Sarah, finding the young, startled face of David by the hearth. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken history. Amelia's face softened, the tired lines easing into understanding. She didn't look shocked. She looked like someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed. "He's safe now," Sarah stated, feeling the weight of the lie lift slightly. "He was Mrs. Peterson's." Amelia nodded slowly. "I knew she was hiding someone. She told me to trust the next person who came, if they seemed like they were struggling too. She just never told me who." Amelia took a cautious step inside, her eyes assessing David, then Sarah. Ethan, who'd been hiding slightly behind his mother's legs, finally stepped forward. He walked slowly toward David, who shrank away slightly. Ethan didn't speak about the water, the candy, or the secrecy. He simply pointed to the blanket Sarah had given David. "Grandma Peterson made that. It's the warm one." It was a small, practical truth, spoken without judgment, linking all three adults through the silent love of the woman who had prepared this impossible inheritance. Amelia set the thermos down on the table, not asking for coffee this time, but offering it. "We'll figure out what comes next, but first you both need to eat." Her kindness was an absolute practical force that demanded acceptance. Sarah looked at David, then at Ethan, seeing two boys linked by an absent guardian, and now by a shared need for quiet protection. The silence of the cabin was no longer oppressive. It was a sanctuary. The decision was made not with a legal document or a grand promise, but over a bowl of thick, hot chili Amelia had insisted on bringing. David, still frail, ate slowly, perched on an overturned crate, while Sarah sat opposite, Amelia on the third side of the small scarred table. Ethan was busy organizing the kindling, maintaining the powerful, steady heat of the fire. Sarah realized she wouldn't sell the cabin. The value of the property was insignificant compared to the cost of displacing the broken piece of family her grandmother had left behind. David needed a place to be invisible until they could arrange proper protection, and Sarah, for the first time, felt a responsibility that wasn't a burden, but a choice. Amelia never asked about David's official status, and Sarah never detailed her own financial struggles. They operated on the mountain's currency, mutual necessity, and silent protection. Amelia began bringing extra supplies, pretending they were misplaced deliveries for other properties. She taught Sarah how to manage the wood stove and how to seal the windows properly against the approaching winter. One evening, a week later, Sarah was sitting near the hearth, the air warm and smelling of baked apples. David was asleep on the blanket, a heavy, exhausted sleep. The light from the single bulb was warm and cutting through the vast mountain darkness. Amelia and Ethan had just left after a quick, non-committal check-in. Sarah watched David's chest rise and fall rhythmically. She pictured her own daughter, Lily, who would arrive next month after Sarah finished cleaning and making the cabin truly safe. Lily, who had only ever known the cold anonymity of city apartments, would find a strange, quiet brother waiting for her here. She reached out and carefully tucked the edge of Mrs. Peterson's heavy blanket around David's shoulders. The dustpan was on the hearth, its dark river stone catching the firelight. Sarah finally understood her grandmother's impossible inheritance. It wasn't money, it was the responsibility for another lost soul, a broken piece of the world that needed a wall built around it. She was no longer running from abandonment. She was the one choosing to stay and protect. She looked around the rough, warm cabin, the scarred floorboards, the roaring fire, the sleeping boy. The true secret her millionaire grandmother had hidden was that wealth had nothing to do with cash, and everything to do with who you let inside your locked doors. This story of finding family where you least expect it is one we know you connected with. If you felt the heat of the hearth and the weight of that choice, please show your support. Hit the like button on this video, share your thoughts in the comments about what protection truly means, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional cinematic stories every week.